All right, I think it's time to get rolling here today. Lecture 14, right? And it looks like we're going to make it to spring break, right? So I guess the way the schedule works out, we have a week and a half off from class. It's kind of nice time for a little break, but we have a very exciting subject that we're going to talk about here. And indeed, now is kind of we're roughly halfway through the class. And for the rest of the class, it's almost like we can take all of the stuff we've spent time building up, all of our foundations, and we can just kind of have fun with them. So at this point in class, I begin to get really excited about almost everything that we'll talk about. So game theory, exciting subject. We'll talk about that momentarily. Just a little bit on reading and other sorts of bookkeeping things. So as it happens today, Top Hat is up and working, so I can kind of show you what I have here. I mean, this is my view. I wish I could show you with your view, but you can see here that we basically have 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 as chapters. They're pretty short, so it shouldn't be a huge amount of reading, but that's kind of what's happening, and we do have a little bit of homework, 8, 9, 10, and 11 now, right, sort of building up. Just so you know it's there, maybe I'll fire out an email over the break to say, hey, if you're relaxing on a beach somewhere, how about you just read a little economics or something. I don't know if I want to do that. As soon as I said it out loud, it sounded like a bad idea. So there's that stuff to work on. Here's the calendar. So we're at the 31st, 2, 7, and 9 were off in April. I did originally say we would review the 14th, and then, we would do the 16th, and that would be the kind of, we go over the practice materials exactly like last time. I'm starting to think it's a good idea to just push it back to the 23rd. I'll make the call as soon as we hit the ground running after break, but maybe we can plan on let's just plan on the 23rd. I like the idea of having a review in the class directly preceding. And then this will be like that. All right. There you saw it. Like now I'm committed. It's typed into the computer there. And we'll go with that as our plan going forward. And I think we hashed this out last time, but the exam is not inclusive. It's just the stuff we've covered since the last. I guess that would mean, if I look at the matrix again here, that would mean that it would be chapters 9 through 13 or 14, depending on how far we get, because lecture 8 was kind of, chapters 1 through 8 was everything on the previous exam. So, before we dive into the wonderful world of game theory, I thought I would recap what's happened so far, and then we can talk about why we need to introduce this thing called game theory, right? What it does for us. So you'll remember last time we put all of our tools together in such a way so that we could affect a comparison of monopoly and competition, and really almost everything that we've talked about so far came to fruition when we look at these two graphs. So we talk about our competitive market on the right-hand side, how the supply curve reflects marginal costs of production, the demand curve reflects values, the marginal value of each unit created, I should say. We see producer surplus in in light blue, and consumer surplus in burnt orange. We add those together, that's the total gains from exchange in our market. Well, when we introduce monopoly, we say, well, there's market power now, right? And in this case, the firm now thinks about marginal revenue, not just price. And the big problem here is that every time the firm produces more to sell more, it has to lower the price. So it kind of trades those two things off, right? I'm lowering the price, that's bad for me. I'm selling more, that's good for me. But I want to find a happy medium between the two, and that leads us to marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. And producer surplus here is the blue, and consumer surplus up there is orange. So given our this construction, we can now say, well, yes, we know what a monopolist does. It produces quantity to keep price high in the name of getting some of the consumer surplus. In so doing, the monopolist destroys some of the societal surplus, right? Some of the gains from trade. You can see that because the area of the combined shapes over here is smaller than it is over there, right? Put another way, deadweight loss due to monopoly. So a lot of moving parts, but really in the end a very simple construction. Of course, we could bring in some other things. We didn't talk about entry and exit and barriers to entry and the practical aspects. And we also didn't talk about average costs, right, being forced to their minimum in a competitive market over time. We're going to talk more about that later. I chose not to belabor the point today because I think it'll become really interesting once we get some of these ideas in place today. So the other thing you might add is once we now know there's a social problem with monopoly, right, that is to say it results in lower societal welfare, we can then say, all right, well, what do we want from what sorts of policies might we introduce, and what is the ultimate aim of policy here? Well, the ultimate aim, starting with the second thing first, is to get the market to look more like a competitive market, right? That's ultimately what we want, is the monopoly to be more like a competitive market. And there's a couple things we could do to get this, right? To get rid of this deadweight loss. We could encourage competition, right? We saw how historically policy has done that by, say, breaking up big firms into smaller chunks that compete. We could regulate price. That's kind of what we do with electricity and with the MTA and with stamps and things like that. So those are two alternatives to thinking about how we can deal with this monopoly power. But of course, the other maybe interesting side of this coin is that we also create monopoly power through our industrial policies, right? Things like patents and copyrights create some degree of monopoly power out there. And so, we can't say everything, but we're going to say more after we get some more tools to work with here. And we would like to think about, what sort of role does monopoly play in encouraging growth? Because this is kind of what an entrepreneur wants to do, right? Like if you're Steve Jobs or Elon Musk, what you want to do is create a new product that's all yours, right? A Tesla or an iPhone, something like that, and make an enormous amount of money in so doing. You might sort of think about that as maybe the most obvious aspect of, making a very successful multi-billion-dollar firm. But the other side of it is that everybody in this room gets a product that we really like and really use all the time, right? Such as an iPhone. So we have to think about that a little bit. I'd like to think a little bit more about monopolies that don't fit the classic mold, right? When you talk about, say, Facebook, what they're doing is something different than restricting quantity and keeping price up like a good old-fashioned steel company. And then there's these retail monopolies like Amazon that we have today. And I just like to talk about this because I like economic history, and there's some they get short shrift in the history of the United States in particular. The role that these retail monopolies have played. So I have a little riff on that. But before that, we'll get some more tools in place, and we'll use these tools at least initially to think about, I guess, the gray area or the area in between competition and monopoly. If you want to think about it in one way, I guess I can just do this. We have kind of a spectrum out there. On one end, there's competition. And on the other, there's monopoly. And those are sort of the poles, right? The pure endpoints of some spectrum. But in between is kind of almost everything that we actually observe, right? All the interesting stuff, put another way, is in between, the realistic stuff. And as it turns out, we can say a great deal about what economic activity looks like by sort of thinking about some sort of combination of these two things, right? And so the big two, I'll say, and you might think about the bottom one here being closer to the left. I know this is kind of technical here, but monopolistic competition, my last bullet point, you sort of think about as a situation where there's a lot of small firms, and maybe firms can enter and exit the industry, but they're all a little different, right? So think fast food restaurants, or think about coffee shops. Every coffee shop's a little bit different, but there's a lot of them. and they're competitors, but each has a little bit of market power. That's something like monopolistic competition, and we'll be able to say something about these firms as we move along, right? Situations like that. So now, and maybe some things that'll be surprising and interesting to you. One of the great things about that, by the way, is just how much, I think we spend a lot of our time, especially in New York, with companies that are sort of like that, right? You buy lunch, you go to delis, coffee shops, I already said, a lot of activity there. On the other end of the spectrum, maybe not all the way to monopoly, is the oligopoly situation we have, right? Which is where there are a few really big firms in the industry that produce similar but once again distinct things. So, Samsung and Apple both produce phones, and of course there's the classics is automobile companies, soft drinks. I don't know why I say who says soft drinks? Soda, or beverages maybe, like Coke, Pepsi. That's kind of what I had in mind. There's the big retail stores. Once again, they're kind of interesting to think about. What I have in mind is Costco and Target, places like that. So we want to think about these things, which aren't really pure monopoly and aren't really pure competition. And we can do so if we supplement our basic ideas and tools a little bit. But what we really need to make this work is we need to sort of back up and maybe, I don't know if I want to say start from the beginning, but we want to think about how competitors interact, right? How can we describe the interactions between these companies? And what we need to do this is we need to sort of come up with a general idea as to how firms make decisions in these contexts, right? When you're competing against your well-defined neighbor or your well-defined fellow industry member. So if you think about it this way, it's a little like the way we set up our competitive model, right, was we set it up so firms didn't really compete with one another. Interestingly enough, right? All they did was react to a market price. So that was, and maybe that was a little clever aspect of the model that I slipped past you, but it was set up to make this very complex thing, competition, very simple. All we have is a firm that looks at a price. Now with monopoly, we kind of did the opposite. We said, okay, well now the firm is the market, but still there's no interaction with other firms, really, right? And so the question then becomes, how do we think about these situations where people have to interact? And this is what economists use game theory for, so-called game theory. And so what is game theory? Well, we like to consider it our brainchild as economists, but it actually grew out of just the general analysis of strategic interaction, and in turn part of, so for example, operations research, that field which grew out of World War II and problems of planning in the face of strategy and things like that, this grew into this thing called game theory, this analysis of strategic interaction. In 1950, I'll talk about John Nash in a second, a giant leap forward was made by John Nash, who developed a way of solving just about any game. And he won the Nobel Prize. Did he win the prize for Nash equilibrium? He also made some other contributions. The Nobel Prize in economics, I might add. So this is our theory of, and of course we've talked about how everybody's rational in economics. You might think about game theory as interactive rationality, right? So now I'm rational and I'm playing a game. I'm trying to do as best I can, but I have to compete against you. Maybe our odds are at cross purposes. Maybe they aren't. That would depend upon the game. How do I proceed, right? How do we, or as economists, how do I sort of envision someone playing your typical economic game? So how do we start? Obviously, we want this model to be portable, like everything we've done. We want to be able to move it around and analyze all these different situations. So typically, what we do is we just start with a basic description of a game. Who are the players? What sorts of actions might they take? What are the rules, right? Like, do players go sequentially or do they go at the same time? All this stuff. And then what are the payoffs? That is to say, what do I get when I make a choice and you make a choice, right? And indeed, I sort of think about this, if you're having trouble picturing what I mean. If you look in an economics book, you'll see some abstract mathematical notation. And indeed, game theory gets really hard, really fast with the mathematics. But the good news is you can get really far, really fast with just good old-fashioned logic, as I hope to show you, coupled with game theory. So I tend to think about the player's actions and rules. That's kind of like when you flip over the Monopoly game and you look at the little description. It says for 2 to 4 players, there's a little game piece you take, and then it says every turn starts this way, and it sort of goes through a list of things that happens. The game ends when this, and this person wins, right? That's kind of what we have in mind. And the assumption that we'll be starting with, by the way, you can back away from this assumption, and you often do in your higher level economics classes, contract theory and stuff like that, even micro 300. Complete information, we're going to mainly focus on the case where everybody knows exactly what the game is, and everybody knows what the rules are and who the players are and all that stuff. And if that troubles you, oftentimes you can sort of say, well, I can sort of contingently know all the rules. So there's one game that I used to play with my kids that had this random thing where, depending on a certain stage of the game, it would sort of become this completely different game. We all sort of know that stuff too, would be the idea. So it's funny, one year on vacation, I think on spring break, I actually read a book about games and their history. And it's funny, like there's a lot, one of the first kind of board games ever made that was different than, say just chess, which has been around for millennia, was this game called Kriegspiel, which was kind of like the Prussian army developed it to train their officers. It was kind of like they were playing something like Risk or, where they had this map and, it's kind of interesting. And so there's this book, I'll have to dig it up, that has this history of games and board games and all that. It's fun to read. Okay, so, of course, maybe we should start with simpler games. Settlers of Catan, any Catan players out there? That's I've played that with my kids. It's like every other game you play with your kids, it devolves into a terrible catastrophe. But those are games that maybe are a little simpler than Kriegspiel, but they are also pretty hard to analyze. So what we're going to do is start with maybe the simplest possible game here. What's going on here? And we're going to think about just some basic concepts of solving this game. I guess we'll do the latter first. And so how do rational players play a game? We're going to say, well, what I'm going to do is whatever you do, I'm going to play my best possible response. What I mean by that is I'm going to play the response that ultimately gives me the highest payoff, right? And I'm going to assume that you do the same thing to me, right? That you're just as smart as I am, and also that everybody knows this. You're going to play the game to the best of your ability with the idea of getting the best payoff, and you know that I know that you know, so on and so forth. A couple things that we'll use here that fall out of this definition of this idea that players are rational is, first of all, this notion of a dominated strategy, right? So what is this roughly? It's a strategy that you would never play, right? You just look at it and you're like, that's a losing strategy. I'm never going to do that. So it turns out, the role this plays is we can just sort of say those things will never be part of anybody's decisions, right? And of course, there are also dominant strategies, which are things that are always best, right? And we'll see mainly with these two ideas, not completely, or 3 ideas, I should say, best responses, dominated strategies, we can get pretty quickly to a solution, as we will define it, of a game, which will be something like an equilibrium. And in fact, the best responses to best responses will ultimately give us this description of this thing called Nash equilibrium, which is named, of course, after the aforementioned John Nash. Now, it used to be when you would teach an economics class, everybody would know who John Nash is, right? Has everybody heard the name before? So, yeah, almost nobody's heard the name John Nash before. Why would this be the case? Well, let me look at my link here. There was a movie made in 2001 about John Nash called A Beautiful Mind, And it's actually a somewhat sad and tragic tale. Nash was maybe one of the towering geniuses of all time, right up there with a lot of the other people who found themselves at Princeton, in the years in and around the World War II years. But he did have severe mental health problems, and had problems with just kind of going insane. So this is kind of his story, but it's actually a good movie. I didn't look at that closely. I think it was nominated if it didn't win some awards. Anyways, so he came up with Nash equilibrium. Okay, so what I'm going to do is we're going to start with a very boring game. I don't know if you'd ever want to play this, but believe it or not, in experimental economics, one thing economists do is they get subjects like yourself, like usually college students, get you all together and play some of these games just to see if what people do corresponds with what theoretical predictions are. So it's not very exciting game. This game is called right, left, up, down, right? And each player, there's two players, R and C. Why did I name them that? Well, you'll see in a second. It'll help us organize the game on a game board, right? R and C. And so R has exactly two things they can do, right? Each player has one turn. Each player moves at exactly the same time, right? So it's not that exciting. Great game. And player R can go either up or down, right? And player C can go either left or right. And once all those decisions have been made about what to do, the game is over and the players get the payoffs as follows, right? So for example, the way you would read this, if player R chooses up and player C chooses right, R gets 0 and C gets 2, right? If player R chooses down and player C chooses right, well, both players get 2, right? Okay, so I guess you can see here in this particular context, we like to start with things as simple as possible to understand how they work before we make things more difficult. This is as simple a game as you can have that's remotely interesting, right? 2 actions, 2 players. Okay. Now, of course, it's like any game, it's hard to sort of see what it looks like or how to play it without looking at the game board. And luckily, as economists, we have a notion of this. It's called the normal form. The technical term is the normal form of the game. And that's the normal form up there in the upper right-hand corner of my slide here. And so you can see how it's organized here. And now maybe you can see why I called the players R and C. Player R is really the row player. Player C is the column player. The row player chooses either the top row by choosing up or chooses the bottom row by choosing down. Player column chooses left or right, right? Now, the way the payoffs are listed, you would say, what I've done is taken everything on this list here and just, so for example, up left, that would correspond with the upper left corner of my normal form matrix. Well, the row player's payoff will be listed first, and then C's payoff will be listed second. So it'll be 3, 1 in there, like that, right? 3, 1. Now, let me get my marker out here. Maybe I'll just copy this down. Sort of wondering about my game here. I can just reproduce the game here. So oftentimes you can write it, you just put the payoffs more like this. So the row player's up here, the column player's down here. This is 0, 2. This is 1, 2. And this is 2, 1, right? And we can there's a couple ways you can solve this, and maybe in so doing, if we solve this game, what do I mean by solve? I mean figure out what the player's strategies are, right? And then see what everybody gets in the end when everybody plays their strategies. That's what I mean by solve. Maybe I'll just complete this. Here's up, down, left, right, like that. And oftentimes what you can do is you can just I say here, do best response dynamics. That's a fancy way for just saying, just guess at something and then see what happens, right? Or just guess a strategy and then say, well, what will the player do here? So the way you might do this is you might say, let's suppose that player 1 here, or player row, let's suppose player row chooses up, right? And that's a sensible way to start, right? Because when they choose up, they get a payoff of 3, right? Now, the question is, if we start here, what is player column's best response to this, right? So now you can sort of think about it this way. Player R has chosen a row, yes? Player 2, or player C, I should say, has to choose L or R. Now, you can see here 2 is greater than 1, right? So player 2 will choose R. Put another way, R is the best response to U. Yes? By the way, now that we've said, okay, well, when player R chooses U, player C chooses R, you can sort of say, well, we know this isn't an equilibrium outcome. The game will never end there, put another way. Why is that? Because it's not rational for player C to ever choose L, because their payoffs are higher here. Well, we can keep going, right? We can say, okay, well, now suppose player C chooses R. What is player R? What is R player's best response? Row player. Well, let's see here. Row player gets 2 from choosing this, right? From choosing down, right? And gets 0 from choosing up. I'm sorry. Player 2 gets 1 from choosing down and 0 from choosing up. Yes? So we can say that player R will choose this. So when player C chooses this, chooses to go right. Sorry, I'm getting confused with my notation here. When player C chooses right, player R chooses between 0 and 1, or up and down. They'll obviously choose this. So that would get rid of this. We can say that that's not the Nash equilibrium either. Okay, keep going. Now, player R is choosing down, right? Well, let's see. When player R chooses down, player C is now comparing 1 and 2, right? 2 is greater than 1. Player C's best response is to choose R. Player R is choosing D, and that leaves us here, right? So nobody has any incentive to deviate once we get to this point, and we would say that this is the solution to this game, right? Put another way, when the players sit down at the dinner table or at the dining room table to play the game of row, what did I call it? Up, left, up, down, right, left. We can say that whoever's playing row will choose down, and whoever's playing column will choose right, and the game should end here. It's kind of what we have in mind. You can check this. You can say, okay, well, let's see. If R is choosing D, what's C's best response? Well, let's see. 0 from, when R is playing D, C gets 2 from playing R and 1 from playing L. Best response is to play R. Well, when C plays R here, what is the row player's best response? Well, let's see. If they choose up, they get 0. If they choose down, they get 1. So best response going one way, best response going the other way. That's how you would sort of solve this game. And you notice, by the way, I'm embarrassed that I got a little, every time I start this off, I get a little mixed up as to which payoff corresponds with which player. That takes a little practice. That's what you have to do. I did a little experiment last night with ChatGPT, and I said, just give me 10 2x2 games in matrix form, and I'll solve them for the Nash equilibrium. And it was really good. It was really good for practice. And it's really satisfying if you can get good at this. One more thing about this game. It turns out one of these players has a dominated strategy. I guess if you flip that around, they have a dominant strategy, right? How do I know this? Well, look at this. Look at row player, or look at this row choice for column. Whenever column chooses row, or chooses right, whenever column player chooses right, they get 2, right? If they ever choose left, they get 1. So you would say that right always gives a higher payoff than left. And so you can say anybody who's the column player will always just go right, because they're guaranteed a higher payoff. So once you know that, then it's really just a choice between up or down for the other player, and that's just a choice between 0 and 1 for the row player. So once again, that's another way to wind up here. So maybe you have a lot of questions. You're saying, boy, that looked a little bit harder than you said it would. That's true. You might even say, am I guaranteed to always find an equilibrium of this game or an ending point? We'll see that the answer is no, and that's actually quite an interesting thing here. But that's generically how we think about solving a game. So I have a couple further examples here. And you know what? Maybe I'll give you a minute. Just look at this. Look at the top game there and see if you can just, in your mind's eye, use some ideas here to figure out what the Nash equilibrium is of this game. And then I'll dive in here. All right, you know what? Maybe I'll do the same thing, and as you're continuing here, I'll erase, and then we'll do this one. Do these on the board. So let me just see here. I'll write this out in my. So here we have up, down, left, right. 1, 2, 0, 0, 2, 1, 3, 2. Now, if I'm looking at this game here, one of the first things I might notice is that the player choosing rows has a dominant strategy, right? Put another way, one of their strategies is dominated, right? Well, that's because down gives 3 or 1 or 2 or 0, right? They get 2 units a higher payoff whenever down is chosen. So there's never any reason for the row player to choose up. So you can kind of say, all right, well, this is a dominant strategy. We know that anybody playing this game is going to choose D, right? Given that, now the player choosing left or right, the column player, is making a choice between 1 or 2. Well, 2 is greater than 1, right? So column will choose L. So we wind up finding out that this outcome, when player row chooses down, player column chooses left, is the Nash equilibrium. And you can even test it out by thinking about best responses. So if player column chooses left, down faces row player faces a choice between 3 and 1. Down is better. So this is a best response. If we flip that around and say row player plays down, now column player is choosing between 2 and 1, right? 2 is greater than 1, so column will always choose left. Okay, so that's another game there. Now you may not realize it now, but let's take. You know what? I'll take my time drawing this bottom game down up on the board here, and you can kind of contemplate it while I'm doing that. See if you can make sense of it. I know it takes practice thinking about these things. Which payoffs go where and how payoffs change with actions. So clean this up here. Throw in some payoffs. 3, 3, 1, 4, 4, 1, 2, 2. All right. Interesting. All right, let's give it a whirl here. This is, by the way, another game which the lingo would say is dominance solvable, right? Meaning each player has a dominant strategy, right? It turns out. The game is also symmetric. So you can see the payoffs are symmetric in a particular way. And each player has a dominant strategy. Let me ask you, what is row player's dominant strategy? The player choosing between U and D. D, yes, because 4 is greater than 3, 2 is greater than 1. Yeah? So this is in fact the dominant strategy. What about column's dominant strategy? Well, let's see. Same thing, right? Well, it's right. 4 is greater than 3, 2 is greater than 1. Each player always does better playing, well, the row player always does better playing down. Column player always does better playing right, and that leaves us with this as the Nash equilibrium. Now you may or may not know it, but this game we attach great significance to, right? This particular game. One thing I just kind of blew past on the game up there, the upper left game, is that ultimately you'll remember the Nash equilibrium was the 3-2 point, right? A point of interest about that is we might think about that as being the desirable outcome as well, right? Why would I say that? Well, because the payoffs are jointly highest there, yes? Players, if you add that together, you get a total payoff of 5. That's the highest. Now, down here, something interesting happens, right? We wind up with the joint payoff that's the lowest in some ways being the outcome, right? The Nash equilibrium, put another way, leads us to a position where 2-2 is the equilibrium of the game, where we might expect it to stop. But at any other box, the sum of the payoffs is higher. In particular here, both players are strictly better off than they are down here, right? Interesting. This is called the prisoner's dilemma. And we think about it, you might think about it as the first appearance in this class of an example where competition leads to bad outcomes, right? Collectively bad outcomes. Previously in class, we argued that wasn't the case, right? Competition, competitive markets anyways, led to good outcomes. By the way, if you want to think about what all this has to do with oligopoly, I've probably put that off as long as I can. You can think about, sort of the stuff that we've learned about in talking about marginal revenue and all that stuff. We can now, change the story so that the competitors are businesses, right? And they face business decisions. So we're going to think about oligopolists. So this is like Coke and Pepsi, right? I have an example from Ajinomoto and ADM, Archer Daniels Midland. They produce lysine. More on that in a second. Why do I have that one? Because it's a pure duopoly. Those are really the only two firms in the industry, so it corresponds kind of closely to this. So in this way, what you can think about is the firms face this decision. Well, or a simplified version: do I, produce a little and behave like a monopoly? Given my competition is there, or do I produce a lot and behave competitively, right? So the firms, instead of choosing up or down, the row player is choosing behave like a monopoly, produce a little bit, keep prices high, or produce a lot, right? Low prices, right? And behave competitively. And the firms have to simultaneously decide, do I be competitive or do I be monopolistic, right, with regards to my competition, right? And so my next slide, it's actually Paul Krugman came, like so many other things, he came up with the idea of using this. It's about lysine, right, which is an additive that is used in animal feeds, but it makes a conspicuous appearance in the Jurassic Park movie, so I thought we'd maybe see why that is. So, how many people have seen Jurassic Park, the original? Okay, so we're doing a little bit better with Jurassic Park than we are with A Beautiful Mind. In a couple of classes, we'll be diving deep into classic movies. Anyways, Jurassic Park here. So this is the scene where that's Samuel Jackson there. They've discovered that the grid is down. It's been sabotaged. Someone has made off with some of the genetic material of the dinosaurs, and now they're trying to figure out what to do to get the park up and running again.
But I won't do it.
Shutting down the system is the only way to wipe out everything that he did. Now, as I understand it, all the systems will then come back on their original startup mode.
Correct. Theoretically, yes, but we've never shut down the entire system before. It may not come back on at all.
Will we get the phones back?
Yes, again, in theory.
What about the lysine contingency?
Ooh.
We could put that into effect.
What's that?
That is absolutely out of the question.
The lysine contingency is intended to prevent the spread of the animals in case they ever get off the island. Dr. Wu inserted a gene that creates a single faulty enzyme in protein metabolism. The animals can't manufacture the amino acid lysine. Unless they're completely supplied with lysine by us, they slip into a coma and die. People.
So you get it there? So the lysine is it's the additive they left out of the genetic material for the dinosaurs. So in the event that one escapes Jurassic Park, they can just restrict it. It needs lysine to survive, and it will die. So that's the lysine contingency. So I don't know if that makes the game matrix any more exciting, but it looks like this, right? And you can see the logic behind being competitive or being monopolistic, what it looks like in this particular setting. So maybe I'll draw this up here, and we can do what we usually do. You can see here that each firm, the way we've drawn this matrix, is just kind of they have a very simple stylized decision, but you can think about this as, producing 30 million pounds of lysine. That's just being monopolistic, right? Taking an action that restricts quantity to keep industry prices high in the name of making more profits. But now the twist is, in a monopoly, each firm does this. A firm would just do it on its own. Here, each firm has to think about what its competitor is going to do. If I behave monopolistically, will my competitor do the same? And so if I were to fill out the payoff matrix, it kind of looks like this. We have, I'll call it M and C, and M and C. That's kind of behave monopolistically, even though there's another firm there, behave competitively. So this is 30 million pounds. I'll just let you fill that in. The key thing is that the payoffs are kind of like this. 180, 180, 150, oops, not like that. 150, 200, right? 200, 150, and then we have 160, 160. So the idea here is that it builds in this logic that, if we both behave monopolistically, we get $180 million in profits jointly. But if ADM behaves monopolistically and Ajinomoto does not, well, that's kind of an undercutting, right? That's like, haha, you've decided to restrict your quantity and be nice and keep the market monopolistic. Now I've jumped in and been competitive. I've produced a lot. I'm underselling I'm selling more to the market, and I'm taking advantage of you being monopolistic. So that's kind of what happens here, and it reduces ADM's profit and increases Ajinomoto, right? Down here, the story is switched, right? Aha, ADM has behaved competitively, whereas Ajinomoto has not. And of course, if both are competitive, well, then the market gets closer to a competitive market with smaller profits. Now, the Nash equilibrium here, you can see, follows exactly the logic that we described in the previous game, right? And in fact, you can see here that each firm has a dominant strategy, right? Each firm's dominant strategy here is to behave competitively, right? So look here, if I behave competitively, I get 200 or 160. If I were monopolistic, I get 180 or 150, right? So being competitive is a dominant strategy for me, if I am ADM. Same with Ajinomoto. Let's see, 200 or 180, 160 or 150. So we wind up finding that both firms will behave competitively, and that we wind up here, right? So there's a lot to unpack here with this result. First of all, this is bad news for the two firms, right? They would like to be monopolistic, to act with some restraint and not compete with their counterpart, right? But the logic of the game, or you could say even the incentives provided by what we would get if we undercut, keep us from doing this. And I say, well, I'd like to be monopolistic. That would make life in this industry easy. But you would have to be monopolistic also. The problem is, if you're monopolistic, then I have a really big incentive to undercut, right, and be competitive. You've left the market open to me. And I say, all right, well, so I'm going to be competitive. And of course, you're thinking exactly the same way, being rational, and that logic pushes us to this point here. Bad news for firms, right? But good news for us as consumers, right? We're sort of saying that this game suggests that even a small number of firms, right, two firms in this case, because of the logic of game theory and the prisoner's dilemma, as why do I keep calling that, I'll tell you in a second, they will behave competitively even though it seems like they could do jointly better by being monopolistic. Now, as it happens, when firms get together and they're in this situation, they often want to make a collusive agreement, right? Collusion is, of course, illegal, and in fact, these two firms were smacked by an antitrust lawsuit because they were trying to collude and behave so they could get up into that 30-30 box and make more profit, right? So it's actually illegal to collude, and this, that might be another aspect of antitrust policy. You can see why here, that when firms compete, they wind up making less profits, which is good for us again. So why is this called the prisoner's dilemma? Well, the prisoner's dilemma, it's basically this idea that, the incentive to cheat is just too powerful in some circumstances to sustain, I guess, collusion or cooperation here. So the standard backstory that game theorists have always told is that two suspects, right, who have committed a crime together are caught and separated, and there's insufficient evidence to really put them both away for a long period of time without some sort of confession. So here I have Thelma and Louise. I don't know if anybody's seen that movie. Thelma and Louise, no? Susan Sarandon. Gina Davis. I think that was Thelma. Is that who it is? No? Am I wrong about that, or is that you haven't seen it? Brad Pitt, a very young Brad Pitt was in that movie. What's that? Yeah, I'm pretty sure I'm right about that, yeah. Anyways, so it's a great movie, but they go on a little crime spree. It's worth watching. Anyways, so you can imagine that we've caught them, and what we do is we do the usual thing in the police lockup. We say, all right, well, we're going to separate you each into separate interrogation rooms, and we're just going to try to get a confession here. And we say, and Thelma and Louise know that as they part ways, they say, don't confess. We know they'll only get us for 5 years if we don't confess. And then we say, hey, Louise, you're here in this room. You know what? Thelma's not confessing. If you confess, your sentence will go down to 2 years, right? Thelma will get 20 years. Thelma will do the hard time, but you'll be out in 2 years if you confess, right? And Thelma doesn't. Meanwhile, we say the same exact thing to Thelma, right? Hey, if you confess and Louise doesn't, well, you'll get off pretty easily with the 2-year sentence, and Louise will do the hard time, right? Well, of course, the logic of the game suggests that in the end, well, both players trying to get the light sentence results in Louise and Thelma both getting a 15-year sentence, say, instead of a... And this is strictly worse for them, right? But then again, better for us as society, because we've, apprehended the criminal, so to speak. Yes?
Wouldn't it be better just
Well, there is that, right? You would say, don't go on a crime spree.
or just do your 5 years.
That would be better for them, yes. Right? But the point, I guess, or one of my points here is that the logic of game theory and best responses to best responses suggests that the players won't be able to do that.
I was asking, aren't there rules in place that prevent too many monopolies?
Yes. This is exactly part of the whole antitrust suit. And I think what you're talking about is, we didn't mention it last time, we said that there is such a thing as policy to encourage competition. So for example, we talked about Standard Oil being broken up. But then there's also policy in place to prevent smaller firms from coming together and making collusive agreements, right? And so that might be, something like, Ajinomoto and ADM making some backroom deal to restrict production, right? So as to keep the lysine production down and the price up and make more profits. Now, you might sort of say two things about that. That's illegal, right, as part of antitrust law for good reasons. But you also might say that it's sort of unstable, right, because of the logic of game theory, that there's always an incentive to cheat on these agreements. But this begs the question, why in some circumstances, do collusive agreements persist? So a great example of this is OPEC, right, which is a cartel, right? And what does that cartel do? It gets together to make a joint decision about how much each country in the organization should produce, right? And it's exactly trying to get to that upper left box here. Of course, it's tough to, OPEC is sort of outside the realm of U.S. antitrust law. But that's the idea here. And in this way, it's kind of good news, right? So cooperation versus defection more generally is kind of part of this whole general framework. So we can talk about prison sentences, we can talk about behaving like a monopoly or competitively, but people have used this very model in just about any situation to capture this idea, right? This idea that oftentimes our competitive nature, right, or the fact that we can sort of make a problem someone else's problem, they've sort of used this basic idea in all of these different settings. So we have this, up there is my environmental policy game, international environmental policy, where we have two countries deciding whether or not to reduce emissions to get a better environment, a global environment. And so the upper left box is intended to reflect this idea that, it will cost us, each 3, if you want to think about it this way, if we both reduce our emissions, right? But what would be really great for me, for my country, is if you reduced your emissions a lot and I didn't do anything, right? We would get maybe to the same target level of emissions, and that would give me the 4-1 there, right? That's actually a weird diagram up there. I don't know if that's exactly right. But essentially, you can see here the idea. You could also, maybe it works a little better here. Let me think about that. If we both reduce emissions, we get 3. We don't reduce emissions, we get 2. Yeah, okay, no, I was right. We do fairly well if we both reduce emissions, but what is best is if you reduce your emissions and I don't reduce mine at all. That pushes us to 4-1, say. Of course, this logic leads everybody to not reduce their emissions, and then we wind up in a worse world at 2-2 rather than 3-3. I don't know, I kind of messed up the story to begin with there. Disarming, same kind of idea, right? If everybody could disarm, here, this is an old one, the US and the USSR, right? So that was back from when I was in elementary and high school, I guess. If we could agree to get rid of our nuclear weapons, we would all be better off, 3-3. But what's even better for me is if you get rid of your nuclear weapons and I keep mine, right? Then I have the power. That pushes us to 4-1. Of course, in the end, this logic results in everybody keeping their nuclear weapons, 2-2. So this model moves around and does all sorts of things, and whether or not the outcome is good for society, well, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But it is this general model of collective action sorts of situations, right, in which self-interest, if you want to think about it that way, ruins the possibility of cooperating. Right? And so you might sort of, if you're an economist, this is a big question for you because we tend to believe competition is a good thing, right? That it encourages efficiency And for all the reasons that we've talked about, but this model might suggest that there's a whole variety of situations where that's not true, right? And there is something lurking in the background as well, in that oftentimes we might say, well, is there a way out of this, right? Like what sorts of policies or institutions might get us out of these collective action sorts of problems? Am I doing on time here? Pretty good. So it turns out that even if you take a biology class, biologists like these sorts of examples, and there's this classic hawk-dove game, which has to do with, I guess, two birds coming together to fight over a mate or something like that. And really what you want to do is, or really what the best case scenario is one in which, one party, even if everybody's talking tough, if someone backs down, right? So hawk is being tough, dove is being, all right, backing off. You always want someone to back off. And in this case, you can see everybody does better if everybody's peaceful, dove, dove. But, it's even better if, for one party, if they're a hawk and the other guy is a dove. Same sort of logic, right? But of course, in a biological setting, when hawks and hawks collide, it's often destructive for both of them, which is the -5 there. All kinds of examples. And depending on how you do this, or how you break down the games, you get all kinds of different results. So it's not a great time in the lecture to do this, but we can also address some other types. Not all games have that general structure, right? Where there's a dominant strategy and where players take actions that are not in the collective interest, right? The selfishness leads to something other than the collective interest. And so I have all these different examples here of various sorts of games. There's the classic stag hunt game, right? Which is a game where there's multiple equilibria, right? That means that we don't have a clear prediction as to a unique thing that will happen, right? But we can also say that some things are better than others. So why is it called the stag hunt? Well, maybe I'll talk my way through this here. So look at the two strategies here. You imagine there's a tribe with two hunters in it, right? And every day the hunter sort of goes out and decides to do one of two things. Hunt hares, right, little rabbits, or hunt stag. Now the catch is, when you hunt a hare, you're always guaranteed at least one unit of output, right? You'll always come up with something. There's a lot of rabbits. They're pretty easy to catch. So you can see, if you look at the hare strategy for the row player up there, 1, 1. Or the hare strategy for the column player, the second number, 1, 1. You always get 1 if you hunt a hare, right? Hunting stag is a big endeavor, right? If I do that successfully, I get a payoff of 3, and you get a payoff of 3. The catch is we both have to decide to hunt stag, right? We need 2 hunters to take down a stag, and we can, but we can do it if everybody participates. So, you think about the Nash equilibrium here. It's basically like this. If you say you're going to hunt stag, then I want to hunt stag too, right? Put another way, you hunt stag, my best response is to also hunt stag. If I hunt stag, your best response is to also hunt stag. Are you hunting stag, Baker? Yes, today. All right, I'm in, right? The problem is there's this other Nash equilibrium where if you're hunting hare, then I'll choose to hunt hare too, right? So I say, hey, are you going to hunt hare? You say, yeah. And I say, okay, well, if I hunt stag, I'll get nothing. That's the 0 up there. If I hunt hare, I'll at least get 1. So the dilemma here is that the stag hunt is clearly best from everybody's perspective, but it's risky in some sense, right? I'm not guaranteed an outcome unless I can depend on you. And so it turns out that even though stag is clearly better, right, and a Nash equilibrium, oftentimes in the lab, more on this next class, people wind up playing hare. Actually, speaking of that, let me fire up the attendance here. I almost forgot. All right, there we go. Let me try this. Try my dual system here. All right. Now over here, we have the classic Knicks-Nets game. This used to be called the Matching Pennies game, or no, this isn't the Matching Pennies, I'm sorry. It used to be called the like a dating game or something like that, but my example's better. So you can think about it this way. You have a friend who's a big basketball fan, right? And you talk to them quickly on the phone. Maybe they're a Knicks fan and you're a Nets fan, or vice versa, it doesn't matter. And you decide you're going to go to the game. Maybe they announce that tickets at the door at these places are cheap, so you can go to the game. And you say, yeah, let's go, and you jump on the subway, and you realize that you said you agreed to go to a game, but you forgot to communicate about which game to go to, the Knicks or the Nets, right? Now, the way the payoffs are arranged is if you want to go to the Knicks game, right? Maybe I'm the Knicks fan playing columns. You know that I get a payoff of 2 from going to the Knicks. You'll get a payoff of 1 from going to the Knicks because you're a Nets fan, right? But really what you want to do is just go to a game with me. So put another way, if I go to the Knicks, you want to go to the Knicks, right? You'll get 1 instead of 0. But if I go to the Nets, you want to go to the Nets even more, right? You get 2 and I get 1. And it's kind of the opposite way as well. So you should be able to look at this and convince yourself that there's 2 Nash equilibria here, right? Where we both go to the Knicks game, or we both go to the Nets game, right? But they're different in terms of how the players prefer those equilibria, right? I want to go to the game together, but I want to go to the Knicks game, right? You want to go to the game together, but you want to go to the Nets game. So you can often think about gains to cooperation here with this sort of this game here. Now, this last game, I'll just pull it over here. Oh, that's not going to work. And I'll just pull this over here. Looks like we're doing pretty well. Pull this down here. Is a game where there is no Nash equilibrium at all. And it's often called it used to be called Matching Pennies because it was based on, flipping coins or whatever. But it's really, you can think about it as the penalty kick game, right? If you're a soccer fan. So, the player taking the kick can go to, can shoot it to the left. Or the goalie can also, the goalie has to sort of choose randomly what to do, to dive to the left or dive to the right. And you can think about this upper left box being the case where, well, let's see. Let me think here. I'm the goalie. I'm choosing, if I go left, right, I'm the row player, I'm the goalie, and you shoot left, that's good. I block your shot. So I get a payoff of 1 and you get a payoff of -1. If I go to the left and you go to the right, you shoot and score, so you get 1 and I lose 1, right? If you go to the right and I go to the right, once again, that's good for me. I get a unit of payoff and you lose a unit of payoff. And so on and so forth, right? Maybe you see what the logic is, but you can also see that there's no equilibrium here in best responses. If you go left, my best response is to go right. If I go right, your best response is to go left. If you go left, my best response is to go left. If I go left, your best response is to go right. So we go around in circles. And what do we do in this case? Well, oftentimes the only thing you can do is really randomize between the strategies. So those are some other canonical games, and we'll be discussing versions of these in, I guess, next class when we do some of the experimental evidence. And one thing we'll talk about here is some ways in which you can use, you can just kind of use these ideas. You don't have to make a matrix and do all that stuff. It's great if you can, but you can use some of these ideas in ways that will give you surprising conclusions, some of which will inform some of those puzzles or ideas that I talked about before. So we're going to talk, I guess, next time when we come back from the break about the famous Bertrand and Hotelling models of oligopolistic competition, right? So the Hotelling model is all about choosing location, right? It's a spatial choice model. The Bertrand model is all about undercutting, right? It's a model of selling identical products and competing with price, right? And so we'll talk about that, and we'll even talk about some crazy extensive form games, as we call them, where people make decisions sequentially. fun stuff. Anyways, have a great break. And I'll linger here for a minute or two if you have any questions. But other than that, see you in a week and a half. You can come up in a